Important people board first, sir. The sentence landed with the confidence of a rule that had never been questioned, and every traveler standing near gate. At 12 turned just enough to watch what happened next. Marcus Carter glanced at the boarding pass still resting between his fingers, the words Executive First Class Suite shining beneath the airport lights. Yet a smiling flight attendant had already stepped aside to welcome another passenger toward the private cabin reserved under his name. Richard Whitmore adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit, accepted a glass of sparkling water without hesitation, and walked through the premium doorway, as if the world naturally opened for men who looked like him. Marcus wore dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a simple black t-shirt beneath a lightweight jacket. Nothing about him announced billion-dollar board meetings or ownership stakes. Nothing suggested that hundreds of employees waited for his approval every Monday morning. He simply stood there while expensive luggage rolled past, and conversations drifted through the terminal like soft background music. A little boy holding his mother's hand pointed toward the doorway and whispered, "Mom, why did they give that man's room away?" His mother lowered her voice and answered, "Maybe they made a mistake." The senior flight attendant smiled politely at Marcus without ever really looking at him. "I'm sorry, sir, but that suite is occupied now. We'll find another comfortable seat for you." Around them, several passengers exchanged quick glances. One businessman shrugged as though these things happened every day. A woman scrolling through her phone barely looked up before returning to her screen. Another traveler quietly moved aside, unwilling to become part of the moment. Marcus read the boarding pass one more time, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. There was no argument, no raised voice, no demand to see a supervisor. His calm seemed almost unnatural, like someone watching rain fall through a window instead of standing in the storm. The young trainee flight attendant, Olivia Reed, stared at the tablet in her hands and frowned. She had checked the manifest twice before boarding began, and she could have sworn Executive Suite 1 belonged to Marcus Carter. She looked toward her supervisor, then back to the screen, uncertainty settling across her face. Richard laughed softly from inside the premium cabin as another crew member hung his designer coat and welcomed him by name. Crystal glasses clinked gently. Warm lighting reflected against polished wood panels. The door remained open just enough for Marcus to see someone settling into the seat that had been prepared for him. He watched without expression, almost as if he expected every second unfolding before him. The airport speakers announced final boarding for Flight 281 to Seattle, while passengers formed a slower line behind him. Somewhere near the windows, thunder rolled across the evening sky, and the glow of runway lights shimmered against the glass. Olivia took one hesitant step toward Marcus before her supervisor quietly intercepted her path with a practiced smile. "Everything is under control," the supervisor whispered. Marcus noticed the exchange, offered Olivia a small nod that carried neither frustration nor disappointment, and picked up the leather travel bag resting beside his feet. The people around him believed they had just watched an ordinary passenger lose an extraordinary seat. None of them realized they were actually watching a test begin, and within the next 30 minutes, every assumption boarding that airplane would become impossible to ignore. Marcus Carter stepped aside without a single complaint and watched the priority lane continue moving as though nothing unusual had happened. The polished floor reflected rolling suitcases, polished shoes, and the glow of departure screens while the crew welcomed every premium traveler with the same practiced smile. Every traveler except him. Richard Whitmore had already disappeared behind the curtain leading into the executive cabin, laughing with another passenger who complimented the spacious private suite. A senior flight attendant accepted his carry-on bag with both hands and said, "We are honored to have you with us today, sir." Marcus heard every word and answered only with silence. There was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. He did not look defeated. He looked patient. Olivia Reed glanced down at her tablet once again, and the same name appeared across the top of the manifest. Marcus Carter, Executive Suite 1. Verified. Priority boarding confirmed. Owner-level hospitality flag. She blinked and refreshed the screen, but before she could study it again, her supervisor gently lowered the tablet. "You are still learning," the woman whispered. "Trust experience." Olivia nodded because that was what new employees did, yet doubt stayed with her like a shadow. Behind Marcus, a middle-aged couple quietly exchanged opinions. Maybe he booked the wrong ticket, the husband said. His wife studied Marcus for another moment. People who make mistakes usually argue. He has not argued once. Their conversation faded beneath another boarding announcement as passengers continued filing onto the aircraft. Marcus adjusted the strap of his leather bag and walked toward the entrance exactly when invited, neither rushing nor hesitating. A gate agent scanned his boarding pass and frowned for a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. "Please wait just one moment." The scanner had flashed green. Olivia saw it clearly from several feet away. So did the captain's assistant standing farther down the jet bridge, carrying a folder marked Executive Operations. She looked toward Marcus with brief recognition before disappearing through the aircraft door without saying a word. Inside the premium cabin, Richard settled into the spacious suite and admired the wide reclining seat, the polished wood finish, and the privacy door that separated him from the rest of first class. "Now this is how travel should feel," he joked, accepting another welcome drink. Several nearby passengers smiled politely. One businessman looked through the partially open divider and noticed Marcus waiting in the aisle. "Is someone else assigned here?" he asked. The senior flight attendant answered immediately. "Everything has been handled." Marcus slowly looked around the cabin, taking in every face, every uniform, every quiet assumption filling the air. 20 years earlier, he remembered standing outside a downtown office wearing the only suit he could afford while a receptionist asked whether he was delivering packages instead of attending the investor meeting. He had smiled then, too. The memory disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Olivia finally gathered enough courage to step closer. She lowered her voice until only Marcus could hear. "Sir, I think something is wrong with the seating assignment." Marcus met her eyes and offered the smallest smile. "I know," he replied calmly. "Sometimes the truth arrives after everyone has already chosen a side." The aircraft door remained open, but the atmosphere inside the executive cabin had already changed. The polished silence that usually surrounded premium travel now carried a faint tension that spread from one row to the next like ripples across still water. Marcus Carter accepted the temporary aisle seat offered to him without complaint, placing his leather bag neatly beneath the seat in front of him while the senior flight attendant closed the divider to Executive Suite 1 behind Richard Whitmore. Richard leaned back with complete confidence, exploring the touchscreen controls and adjusting the lighting above what everyone believed was now his private space. "This airline finally understands loyalty," he said with a satisfied smile. A nearby passenger laughed politely and lifted a glass in agreement. The senior flight attendant nodded. "We always take care of our most distinguished guests." Olivia Reed heard every word and looked once more at the electronic manifest glowing in her hands. The same information remained impossible to ignore. Executive Suite 1. Marcus Carter. Confirmed. Priority verified. She quietly approached her supervisor. "I think we should review this assignment one more time." The woman barely glanced at the screen before shaking her head. "You are reading the system, Olivia." "I am reading people." The answer settled over the cabin like cold air. Marcus heard it without turning his head. Across the aisle, a traveler folded his newspaper and whispered to his wife. He probably booked first class and expected something better. She studied Marcus for several seconds. "Maybe," she answered, although uncertainty had replaced confidence in her voice. Another businessman waiting to store his briefcase looked toward Marcus and smiled politely. "Do not worry. It happens. Sometimes upgrades disappear." Marcus returned the smile with quiet courtesy. "Sometimes they do." He offered nothing more. That calm only made the situation stranger. Most people argued when they believed they had been treated unfairly. Most people demanded explanations. Marcus simply observed every conversation unfolding around him as though collecting invisible pieces of a puzzle. Olivia noticed something else. The captain's assistant had quietly entered the cockpit carrying the Executive Operations folder without delivering the usual pre-flight briefing to the cabin crew. It was an unusual detail, but she could not explain why it unsettled her. Richard pressed the service button. "Could someone bring another sparkling water and the premium menu?" A flight attendant appeared almost immediately. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore." She turned briefly toward Marcus before lowering her voice. "Sir, thank you for your patience while we accommodate everyone appropriately." The words were perfectly polite, yet every nearby passenger understood their meaning. One young traveler scrolling through social media looked up and muttered softly, "Funny how people decide who belongs before checking the facts." His friend shrugged. "That is how the world works." Marcus rested his hands calmly across his knees and watched the evening sun paint long golden lines across the cabin windows. Olivia stood frozen beside the galley, the tablet still glowing in her hands, while one impossible question refused to leave her mind. If the system insisted Marcus Carter belonged in the most exclusive suite on the aircraft, why did every person with authority seem so determined to pretend they had never seen his name at all? Olivia Reed took one slow breath before lifting the tablet again, hoping the screen would somehow change and release her from the growing weight in her chest. But the bright letters remained exactly where they had always been. Marcus Carter, Executive Suite 1, fully verified, special executive protocol enabled, and a discreet gold icon she had never noticed during training rested beside his name like a quiet warning. She looked from the screen to the man sitting calmly in the temporary seat, and then toward Richard Whitmore enjoying fresh fruit and sparkling water inside the private suite that should never have been his. The aircraft felt smaller with every passing second. Engines hummed softly outside while overhead bins clicked shut one by one. Yet inside the premium cabin, another invisible machine had started moving, powered by assumptions instead of facts. Olivia stepped toward the lead flight attendant once more and lowered her voice. "I really think we should confirm this with the cockpit." The woman barely glanced at her. "We have already welcomed the guest in the suite. We are not embarrassing a valued customer because a new employee misunderstood a screen." Olivia looked back at Marcus, expecting frustration, but found only quiet patience. He sat with his hands folded, watching clouds drift beyond the window as though the schedule belonged to him rather than the airline. 2 rows behind him, an elderly veteran wearing a baseball cap leaned toward the woman beside him. "That young lady looks worried." The woman nodded. "Because she knows something is wrong." Another traveler in a gray business suit overheard them and answered with confidence, "If the crew made the decision, there must be a reason." The words floated through the cabin until they reached Marcus, who simply smiled at the reflection in the window instead of responding. Olivia finally gathered enough courage to walk directly toward him. She stopped beside his seat and spoke carefully. "Sir, may I ask if you have traveled with us before?" Marcus turned his head and met her eyes. "Many times." "Have you ever used Executive Suite 1? She continued. "Enough to know the lighting changes automatically when the sun sets," he replied. Olivia looked toward the closed suite door. She had completed weeks of training and did not even know that feature existed. At that exact moment, the cabin lights dimmed slightly and warm amber lighting appeared inside the suite without anyone touching a button. Richard laughed in surprise. "Very impressive service." The lead attendant smiled proudly, believing the automatic system had welcomed the right passenger. Olivia felt her heartbeat quicken. She quietly opened the operations notes attached to Marcus's profile, and a single sentence appeared beneath the executive flag. "Captain greeting required before departure." She stared at the words until they almost blurred together. Captain greeting required. No ordinary premium traveler carried that instruction. She instinctively looked toward the closed cockpit door, then back toward Marcus, who noticed the change in her expression and offered another calm nod that seemed to say everything without speaking at all. For the first time since boarding began, Olivia realized the mistake was far larger than a seating assignment, and somewhere beyond the reinforced cockpit door someone still had no idea that the person everyone had quietly overlooked was already sitting inside the airplane waiting for the truth to catch up. The cabin doors remained open for only a few more minutes. Yet time inside the premium section seemed to slow until every quiet conversation carried unexpected weight. Richard Whitmore leaned comfortably inside Executive Suite 1 while the automatic privacy glass gradually darkened, separating him from the rest of the passengers with effortless elegance. He smiled toward the lead flight attendant. "This airline keeps getting better every year." She answered with confidence. "We are committed to recognizing our finest guests." Just outside the suite, Marcus Carter accepted a paper cup of water offered by Olivia Reed instead of the crystal glass being served to the executive cabin. "Thank you," he said with genuine warmth, making Olivia even more uncomfortable. She had expected frustration or sarcasm. Instead, she found kindness, and somehow that made the mistake feel even larger. The elderly veteran quietly stood and approached Marcus. "Young man, I spent 30 years in the Air Force," he said softly. "One thing I learned is that real leaders never rush to prove who they are." Marcus smiled. "That sounds like wisdom worth keeping." The veteran nodded and returned to his seat. Across the aisle, a financial consultant wearing an expensive watch glanced toward Marcus and whispered to another traveler. If he truly belonged in that suite, somebody important would have stepped in by now. The statement floated through the cabin, gathering silent agreement from a few passengers and doubt from others. Olivia looked down at her tablet once more and opened the detailed executive notes. A second line appeared beneath the captain greeting requirement. "Executive hospitality cannot depart without confirmation." Her hands became noticeably colder. She immediately searched the departure clock. 8 minutes remained before scheduled pushback. At the same time, Richard pressed the service button again. "Could someone adjust the suite temperature? It feels warmer than expected." The lead attendant apologized and tried the control panel, but nothing changed. She tried again. The system displayed one simple message: awaiting executive authentication. She frowned and restarted the panel while pretending everything was normal. Richard laughed politely. Technology always needs attention. Olivia watched from several feet away as another small piece of the puzzle settled into place. The aircraft itself seemed unwilling to recognize the wrong occupant. Marcus quietly looked through the oval window as evening sunlight faded across the runway, and an old memory returned without invitation. 22 years earlier, he had waited outside a corporate conference room after being told the board members were expecting someone with a different appearance. He remembered sitting alone with a paper cup of coffee until the chairman finally walked out, shook his hand, and apologized for what assumptions had almost cost the company. That single meeting had changed his life, but the feeling of being underestimated had never completely disappeared. The memory faded as the cockpit door briefly opened and the captain's assistant stepped into the aisle carrying another folder. She paused, scanning the cabin with growing confusion before quietly returning inside. Olivia noticed every movement. Marcus noticed it too, yet remained perfectly still. The engines outside continued their steady hum, while passengers settled into their seats. Unaware that the aircraft was waiting for one person, everyone except the system seemed determined not to recognize. And with every passing second, the silence itself was becoming the loudest voice anywhere on board. The departure clock reached 6 minutes, and a quiet notification sounded somewhere inside the cockpit. Soft enough that no passenger noticed, but clear enough to make the captain's assistant stop in the middle of reviewing her checklist. She looked down at the tablet connected to the aircraft operations system and read the same message twice. Executive authentication pending. Departure advisory active. She frowned and disappeared behind the reinforced door without speaking to anyone. In the cabin, the lead flight attendant continued smiling with practiced confidence, completely unaware that an invisible process had already begun. Marcus Carter reached into his jacket and removed nothing more than his phone. There was no dramatic call, no raised voice, and no complaint directed at the crew. He unlocked the screen, typed 5 simple words, and pressed send. "Ready when you are." The message traveled somewhere beyond the aircraft, somewhere no passenger could see. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned his attention to the fading sunlight outside the window. Olivia Reed noticed the brief movement and expected another conversation, but Marcus simply folded his hands once again. "You are remarkably calm," she whispered. He answered with the same quiet certainty that had unsettled her from the beginning. The truth does not become stronger because people speak louder. Across the aisle, Richard Whitmore requested another beverage and casually asked when the aircraft would begin taxiing. The lead attendant checked her watch. "Any moment now, sir." She pressed the cabin interphone to confirm readiness, but instead of the usual acknowledgement, there was only a short pause followed by an unfamiliar tone. She tried again and received the same response. Nearby passengers began exchanging curious looks. The businessman who had defended the crew earlier glanced toward the windows. "We should already be moving." The elderly veteran smiled gently without looking away from Marcus. "Sometimes delays have reasons we cannot see." Olivia quietly opened the operation screen again and nearly stopped breathing. A new line had appeared beneath the executive protocol notice. Executive review initiated. Manual clearance required. She had never seen those words before. Training had never mentioned them. She searched the internal handbook, but access to that section required authorization beyond her employee level. The aircraft itself seemed to be waiting for someone else's decision. Richard noticed the growing delay and laughed uneasily. I hope this is not because of the climate control. The privacy suite lights dimmed for a second before returning to normal, and the welcome screen embedded in the polished wall briefly displayed one sentence before disappearing. Awaiting host confirmation. Richard frowned, assuming it was another harmless software issue. Marcus saw the message reflected in the glass beside him, but remained completely still. His expression never changed. Olivia slowly realized that every system inside the executive suite seemed to recognize one passenger, while every human assumption recognized another. Outside, a ground operations vehicle stopped beside the aircraft, and two uniformed staff members stepped onto the jet bridge carrying sealed folders. The lead attendant smiled confidently, believing they were delivering routine paperwork, but Marcus quietly watched the closed cabin door with the calm patience of someone who already knew exactly who was about to walk through it, and understood that silence had carried him farther than any argument ever could. The sound that finally broke the silence was not an announcement, but the smooth click of the cockpit door unlocking, and every conversation inside the premium cabin faded almost instantly as Captain Daniel Hayes stepped into the aisle wearing the calm confidence of a man who had flown thousands of hours and rarely looked surprised by anything. His first glance moved naturally across the executive cabin until it reached Executive Suite 1, where Richard Whitmore responded with a broad smile and adjusted his jacket as though expecting a personal welcome. Instead, the captain continued walking without slowing down. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. He passed the open suite completely and stopped beside the temporary aisle seat, where Marcus Carter quietly watched the evening light settle across the runway. For a brief second, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then Captain Hayes smiled with unmistakable respect and extended his hand. "Good evening, boss. I apologize for the delay. We have been waiting for your confirmation before departure." The single word echoed through the cabin with far more force than any raised voice could have carried. Richard's smile disappeared. The lead flight attendant remained perfectly still with the beverage tray balanced in her hands. Olivia Reed looked from Marcus to the captain and finally understood every warning hidden inside the manifest. The businessman who had insisted the crew must be right slowly lowered his newspaper. The elderly veteran quietly smiled to himself as though an old lesson had just been proven once again. Marcus stood and shook the captain's hand with the ease of two professionals greeting each other after a routine meeting. "No problem, Daniel. I wanted to see how things unfolded naturally." The captain nodded once, immediately understanding the meaning behind those words. Richard leaned forward from inside the executive suite. "Excuse me, Captain, is there some misunderstanding?" Captain Hayes turned politely. "No misunderstanding, sir. Executive Suite 1 was reserved for Mr. Marcus Carter under Executive Ownership Protocol." Richard blinked several times, searching for an explanation that refused to appear. The lead attendant finally looked at Olivia's tablet, and for the first time actually read the information she had dismissed minutes earlier. Her expression changed from confidence to disbelief. Around the cabin, whispers spread from row to row. "Did he say boss? Ownership protocol. Was he here the whole time?" Marcus remained perfectly calm, his posture unchanged, his voice steady. "I never asked anyone to recognize me. I only expected the reservation to be recognized." Nobody answered because nobody could argue with the simple truth of the sentence. Captain Hayes turned toward the operations staff, now entering through the aircraft door, carrying sealed folders. "Please verify the executive seating assignment before we continue boarding." They nodded immediately. Olivia watched Marcus for another moment and realized the most powerful person on the aircraft had never demanded respect, never raised his voice, and never once reminded anyone of his position. He had simply allowed every assumption to reveal itself until the truth walked out of the cockpit on its own, and in the quiet that followed, the polished walls of the executive cabin suddenly felt much smaller than the dignity of the man everyone had overlooked only minutes before. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire aircraft until even the steady hum of the engines felt distant, and then everything began changing at once with none of the urgency that had filled the cabin only moments earlier. The two operations managers stepped forward carrying their sealed folders and greeted Marcus Carter with the same professional respect the captain had shown. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. Executive Operations is ready whenever you are." Marcus nodded politely. "Let us simply restore the correct seating assignment and continue the flight." There was no anger in his voice, only calm direction. The lead flight attendant lowered her eyes as one of the operations managers verified the digital manifest in full view of the crew. Every line matched Olivia Reed's original screen. Executive Suite 1. Marcus Carter. Ownership protocol confirmed. Captain greeting required. Manual departure authorization completed. Richard Whitmore slowly stood inside the suite and looked around as though expecting someone to explain that the moment was only a misunderstanding. Instead, the operations manager smiled courteously. "Sir, we apologize for the inconvenience, but this suite is reserved for another guest. We have prepared an equivalent first-class seat for you just a few rows away." Richard glanced toward Marcus, whose expression remained completely unchanged. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Richard quietly picked up his jacket and travel bag. "I should have asked more questions," he admitted before walking toward his reassigned seat. No one criticized him. No one embarrassed him. The correction itself was enough. Meanwhile, the lead flight attendant attempted to activate the executive welcome sequence again, but the system automatically reset and displayed a new message. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter." The privacy glass brightened, the lighting shifted to a warm golden tone, and the cabin temperature adjusted itself without a single manual command. Several passengers watched in amazement as the aircraft seemed to recognize its intended guest more naturally than the people serving aboard it. Olivia stood quietly beside Marcus until he turned toward her. "Thank you for trusting what you saw instead of what everyone assumed." She looked genuinely relieved. "I almost convinced myself to ignore it." Marcus smiled gently. Integrity usually begins with a small decision that nobody else notices. The elderly veteran slowly started clapping once. The sound echoed through the premium cabin, and after a brief hesitation another passenger joined him, then another, until respectful applause filled the aisle without anyone being asked. The businessman who had earlier defended the crew folded his newspaper and nodded toward Marcus. "I judged the situation too quickly." Marcus answered with the same calm dignity that had carried him through the entire experience. "Most people do. The important part is what we choose after we know better." Even the lead flight attendant finally stepped forward and offered a sincere apology. Marcus accepted it with a simple nod and no lecture. Captain Hayes watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction before signaling that boarding was finally complete. Outside the windows, the last light of evening settled across the runway, while inside the aircraft every person seemed to understand that the greatest change had not been a seating assignment, but the invisible distance between assumption and truth. A distance crossed not by power, but by patience, humility, and the quiet confidence of a man who never needed to announce who he was for everyone else to discover exactly who they had been judging all along. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, the last traces of daylight faded into a deep blue horizon, and the cabin settled into a calm that felt completely different from the uneasy silence of only minutes before. Marcus Carter stepped into Executive Suite 1 for the first time that evening, not with the satisfaction of winning an argument, but with the quiet familiarity of returning to a place that had always belonged to him. The automatic lighting adjusted softly, the welcome screen displayed his name, and a handwritten card rested beside a fresh glass of sparkling water. Captain Daniel Hayes paused outside the suite before returning to the cockpit. "Everything is ready now, boss." Marcus smiled. Everything was ready the moment people chose to listen. The captain nodded and disappeared behind the flight deck door. Olivia Reed remained near the galley for another moment, watching the cabin transform from tension into reflection. She knew she would remember this flight far longer than any training manual or customer service seminar. The lead flight attendant approached Marcus one final time. "Thank you for accepting my apology." Marcus looked toward the rows of passengers where conversations had become thoughtful instead of hurried. Every profession gives us opportunities to serve people we do not know. That is why assumptions are expensive. She quietly repeated the sentence to herself, as if committing it to memory. Richard Whitmore settled comfortably into his reassigned seat and eventually glanced toward the executive suite. When Marcus happened to meet his eyes, Richard offered a respectful nod that Marcus returned without hesitation. There was no resentment left in the exchange, only understanding born from an unexpected lesson shared 30,000 feet above the ground. The elderly veteran closed his eyes with a peaceful smile, while the businessman who had once defended the original decision reopened his newspaper but never turned a single page, still thinking about how quickly confidence could become certainty and certainty could become error. Olivia looked through the cabin windows as city lights stretched below like rivers of gold and realized that the most important seat on the airplane had never been the executive suite. It had been the place where every passenger decided whether another human being deserved dignity before knowing anything about them. Marcus reached for the handwritten card beside his seat and turned it over. The blank back reminded him that every new journey begins with an empty page waiting for better choices than the ones made before. He quietly placed the card back on the table and looked across the peaceful cabin. Nobody was applauding anymore. Nobody was whispering. Nobody was trying to prove anything. The aircraft climbed steadily through the evening sky while hundreds of lights disappeared beneath the clouds, and Marcus understood that real authority had never come from ownership, titles, or private suites. It came from remaining calm when others expected anger, remaining gracious when others expected pride, and remembering that respect should never be reserved for people because of the seat they occupy, but because of the humanity they carry with them wherever they go. Long after the flight reached cruising altitude, those who had witnessed the quiet reversal would remember one simple truth that no reservation system could ever display and no boarding pass could ever print. Dignity belongs to every passenger before anyone decides where they belong.